All right. So, 4 weeks in, we're connecting to Jesus. We're connecting to the church. We're basing all of that connection in love. And now it's time to bold with God. Now, it's time really to connect with one another. Now, just as a little bit of a review, we've learned some things in the last 4 weeks. For example, you can't have a better year in 2011 if you're trying to do it all by yourself. Good. Turn to a neighbor and say, "We got it."
We got it.
All right. And this is where we ran into trouble last week. I'm trying to give you a hint. It's in the title of the whole series. If we're really going to have a better year in 2011, we're going to need some connections. All right. We're 2 for 2. You know, it doesn't take much to make the preacher happy. We just want you to get the answers right. And ultimately, isn't that what you really want to do, is get the answers right so you know how to live life? 2 weeks ago, we learned what the bottom line was. The bottom line, of course, is
love.
Thank you, Gail. You're 2 for 2. 2 weeks in a row. The bottom line for every relationship is love. So turn to a neighbor and say, love is the bottom line.
Love is the bottom line.
Now see, you all liked that. As soon as you said that, Barb Drager smiled. Of course, she smiles most of the time. Finally, last week we started talking about what it really means to be connected to a community. And we're all connected as believers in Jesus to a community. It was initially called the believers. It was initially called the body of Christ. And now we call it the church. Okay. I didn't expect you to all be quite as good at that because you haven't had 3 weeks to learning. But we're all part of the church. And if you're here this morning, you're part of the church, but also a part of this church, this body of believers. Now, how many of you can remember, and I've had to practice this, get my fingers all loosened up. I want you to do this with me. Get ready. Now, if you know this, yeah, that's right, wave. All right, get your fingers ready. Go like this and interlock them together. How many of you remember this? You learned this as a kid. You went, here's the church. Here's the
steeple.
Open the door and see
the people.
You guys are good. You guys are great. I can take you on the road with me. You see, more and more though, I'm convinced that we need to remember that little ditty from our childhood. We need to remember that because more and more in my time outside of the church, I'm finding a great emptiness in our world. I'm finding, in fact, it's what I actually call as a group of people starving to death for lack of real relationships. Starving to death for the lack of real hope. Starving to death for the lack of real life and real love. Now, just so you know, it's been coming a long time. It's really been coming a long time. In fact, I think you can certainly go back to 1966. 1966. Paul McCartney wrote some lyrics to a really important song theologically. You all know who Paul McCartney is in the Beatles. I was going to have Owen sing this, but he only plays. He sings. Oh, no. But listen to these lyrics that were penned and see if it doesn't really describe our world today, he wrote all the lonely people. Where do they all come from? All the lonely people, where do they belong? Now, I know some of you are having real trouble with my getting theological inspiration from the Beatles. Get over it. Because theological inspiration happens all around us. And besides, that was 1966. I was only 5 years old. But if 2011 is going to be a better year, we're going to need some connections, and we're going to have to connect to one another, and we're going to have to battle what Paul McCartney wrote about. Because in reality, where did they all come from? They came from each and every one of our homes. Where do they all belong? They belong connected to each and every one of us. To do that, we're going to have to be real in our relationships with one another. Now, what does that mean? Well, I'm going to try to help you understand. I have 4 keys. How many? 4 keys. For building what I call real connections. Turn to a neighbor and say, there are 4 keys.
There are 4 keys.
Now the first real key, you'll get this really easy, but you might want to write this down because it's going to help you. Real key number 1 is reliability. If you want to be connected to people, you need to be reliable. Now that seems kind of silly to even have to say, doesn't it? You have to be reliable. Well, what that means is that Proverbs 17:17 was right when Solomon wrote, a friend loves at all times. The important part of that verse is not the friend, it's not even love, it's all times. One of the reasons I think many of us feel lonely, and by the way, Paul McCartney's words, while it's easy for us to think about them as being true for all those people outside the church that we know, all the lonely people, where do they come from? All the lonely people, where do they belong? I'm going to tell you that I think oftentimes the holy hour between 10:30 and noon, 11 to 12, whenever your holy hour is, the church. I think oftentimes we as a church live in absolute hunger for real meaning, for real life, for real relationships, and we think that we're the only ones not getting it. But look around you. Go ahead, look around the room. I want you to know that there are people sitting next to you, in front of you, behind you, beside you, across the room, who are hungry, who are starving to death for real relationships. And the first thing we have to do is we have to become reliable. This is about integrity. This is about doing what we say we'll do. This is about becoming who God wants us to be in some ways. In building real friendships, in building real relationships, we have to be reliable. I go to networking groups, and you all know that. And one of the things that I try to teach when I'm leading the network groups is that if you come to a networking group one time and expect to get business, it ain't going to happen. It's just not. Why? Because if you come one time, nobody has an opportunity to get to know you, to get to like you, to get to trust you. Well, I'm going to tell you something else. If you only come to church one time, you're not going to find any answers to your problems there either. It's kind of interesting for those of us who are in the church, isn't it? Why do we keep coming back? Do we keep coming back because, quite frankly, it's what we've done for the last 73.5 years? I think there's some of that in church. Do we come back because of treasured friendships and relationships? I think for some of us that's true. I think there's more people here for the first though than the last. It's because we don't know how to be reliable with each other. we don't know how to be real with each other. A friend loves when, says Proverbs, at all times. Turn to a neighbor and say, to be reliable, you have to love all the time.
To be reliable, you have to love all the time.
You guys are getting this good. I'm giving you long instructions and you're getting it. Smile. It's a good day. The first thing we have to do, the first key, is to be reliable. Now, key number 2 is encouragement, or to be encouraging. How many of you could use some encouragement? I'm guessing almost every hand ought to be up at this point. You know, real relationships are relationships that encourage you when you need it. Jackie Robinson, most of you know that he was a baseball player. He was the first African American to play in the major leagues. Understood what it meant to be encouraged. Every day when he would take the field, didn't matter if it was at home or visiting, he would be booed. One day, he was playing at home in Brooklyn, and he committed an error. Now, you know that every baseball player commits errors, right? Nobody's perfect. But when he committed an error, even in his home stand, the people saw that as reason to boo. They ridiculed him. They threw things on the field at him. Until Pee Wee Reese played shortstop, walked over and stood beside him. Now, those of you who aren't baseball historians, which I'm guessing is most of the people in this room, don't know that Pee Wee Reese was from the South. And he had been vocally opposed to an African American being allowed to play Major League Baseball. On the day that Jackie Robinson was standing at second base with his head hung in just absolute humiliation, Pee Wee Reese finally walked over and stood beside him. And after about 30 seconds, took his left arm and reached out with his right. And immediately, silence fell over the Brooklyn Stadium. And from that point on, when they played at home, he was never good. Never. The man who could have been the most demeaning to him of all reached out and encouraged him simply with his arm. And Robinson later said that that arm around his shoulder certainly saved his career and perhaps his whole life. How often do we need the friendship of another person? Someone who can be simply there for us. And I want you to know, I'm not really even talking about those nights when there's an ambulance in the driveway, or there's been another crisis, you've been fired from your job, or your son or daughter have gotten into trouble. I'm just talking about those days when nothing tragic has happened, but you've just had a no-good, lousy, miserable day. Have you ever had a no-good, lousy, miserable day? It's all right, you're in church, you can own up to it. Every person here has had a no-good, lousy, miserable day. And those days are always, always, always made better if someone can come up and put their arm around you and say, it's going to be bad. We need to be a church that encourages people together. Paul even wrote that in 1 Thessalonians. He says, so encourage one another and build each other up. Far too often, even in the church, we spend our time building walls and tearing each other down. Galatians Chapter 6, verse 2 says, the best way to encourage one another is to carry each other's burdens. Because this is the way you love each other. And even back in the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon understood it when he wrote these words. He said, by the way, two are better than one, because they have a good return for their work. For if one falls down, the friend can help the other up. But pity the one who falls and has no one to help them. So our second key today is encouragement. What was the first key? Reliability. The second key is encouragement. And the third key is authenticity, or being authentic. This is one that I think most of society has trouble with. This is about being honest. This is about being real. Most of us spend most of our lives, and most of our energy, by the way, trying to be something we're not in the eyes of others. We deceive others about who we are. We pretend to be something we're not. You know, my favorite story about this is a colonel in the Iraqi war. He's just been promoted. He sees he's got a new office. It's, quite frankly, in a bombshell, but it's deemed safe and they're rebuilding it. And the colonel sees this private walking up with a toolbox. And so the colonel decides, hey, I want to look good to this private. So he picks up the telephone, and as the private walks in, he pretends he's having this conversation, and he says, well, yes, sir, Mr. President, I'll be happy to do that for you. Then he hung up. And he turned to the private and he says, what can I do for you? And he says, well, sir, I'm really just here to hook up your telephone. We need to be honest with ourselves because most of us are the colonel. If all we're about is making good impressions and keeping up appearances, we're never going to go very deep in our spiritual life. And we'll never be very much like Jesus. For Jesus was real to the very end. He was real even to being on the cross. He was real when he met with Peter and James and John, and he says, my soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. We need to get over ourselves, and we need to be real. We need to become who God has called us to be, but we need to do not be things of this world. So, we've learned to really be connected. First, we have to be reliable. Second, we need to be encouraging. And third, we need to be authentic. That brings us to the fourth key. The fourth key is probably the single most important key. Because the fourth key makes keys 1, 2, and 3 work. In fact, I don't think you can do 1, 2, and 3 without number 4. The fourth key is about how we really live. The fourth key, of course, is loving. We need to learn to live lovingly. This is a key about living connected to the first connection, Jesus. This is a key about learning to live as Jesus lived, learning to live as Jesus did, learning to love as Jesus loved, learning to live in relationship with one another. You see, if we don't live like Jesus lived, loving one another, the first 3 keys are impossible. And quite frankly, not all that important. Because if we're not living with Jesus, if we're not living like Jesus, then our lives, it won't matter how much we fill it with, they're going to be empty. When we live with love as our primary act, we live as a sacrifice. Because that's how Jesus lived. Jesus lived as a sacrifice. And that's what it means to live loving someone. It means loving, or live loving means living, putting the other person first. It means living, looking for the interest of the other. It means living, watching out for the other guy. And that other guy, it might be the person you're married to, or the person close to you. It might be one of your children. It may be the guy going past you on the freeway. I know that sometimes that person going by us on the freeway, we don't think very lovingly about the way they're doing it. Do we? See, this bit of loving like God loved us makes a good reason for us to be reliable. Makes for a good reason to be encouraging. Makes for a good reason to be authentic. You know, when we live loving one another, we can really be connected. We can see and hear the needs. And see, that's what living as a sacrifice looks like. It means that we're going to watch out for our neighbor. We're going to watch out for the person sitting next to us, standing beside us, living with us. Because you see, that's what it means to really be connected. Last week I had you all do something because it was really good for you to do it. So I want you to take your hand again and reach out and touch somebody on the shoulder. Go ahead, yeah, go the other way too. Barbie, okay. You see, if you reach out and you're touching somebody, if you're connected, see, and that's what this is really about. This is about giving you the feel for being connected to someone. You see, when we're connected, we have reason to live differently. And when we have a reason to live differently, we can begin to live being real. First key is to live reliability. Be reliable. The second is to be encouraging. The third is to be authentic. And the fourth is to be loving. So what does that mean? What does that really mean? What does it mean? And here's the most important piece of everything I've said today. You're all going home with some homework. Because you know what? You've all heard this sermon before. You've been hearing this sermon for 75, 80 years. I didn't go beyond 80. I suspect some of you might have been hearing sermons on this before 80 years ago, but nobody in the front row. You see, we have some homework to do. Because here's what I know. If we were really living this way, this way, this room would be full. Because people would be dying to get in the doors. Because people are starving to death, and people who are starving to death will come to where their spirits are fed. They will come where there is real relationship. So maybe we need to think about it. Maybe you need to think about it. One thing you can do to be more reliable. I'll bet you could come up with one thing and write it in your book. How could you encourage someone who has a need this week? One thing in the moment. Who could you offer a word of encouragement to? Who could you be more authentic with? Who could you be more honest with? More real? And who Could you live loving yours this week? If you live real, you'll become real. And we will all be better connected. So reach out and touch someone